Fruit for Thought, Recovering the Original Fruit/Fruits of the Spirit and Harvesting It/Them Today. Written by Art Edwards. Copyright 2022. This presentation and recording were done by Casey Evans with permission from the author. Author's note. Some names and locations in the author's personal stories have been changed. These events happen pretty much as described, at least in my memory. Connections. Jesus, Paul, and John. A funny thing happened after I thought I was done with Fruit of the Spirit. I've been working on the ideas about the Fruit of the Spirit for years. Then, just as I had thought I had finished the previous, and what I thought was the last chapter, I had a thought. Better late than never, I guess. The having a thought experience is one of the remarkable things that comes from reading the Bible and understanding its time, place, and context. There is no way to plumb its depths, measure its breadth, or scale its heights. As soon as you think you've put all the pieces together, you discover not just more pieces, but an entirely new and grander picture. Just when you think you have mined all the ore and extracted all the energy the Bible contains, there's new ore. Though there is meaning in individual words, you can't fully understand a word without understanding the sentence it fills. Likewise, you can't comprehend the sentence without comprehending the chapter, and well, you get it. Before you know it, you're connected to entire universes of time, space, thought, and feeling. Spurred by these truths, I began looking for broader connections, wending their way from the fruit of the Spirit forward to the Gospels and back to Jesus. Paul's fruit, John's Gospel, and Jesus. Here's what my inquiring mind wanted to know. Since the letter to the Galatians was written between 48 and 62 AD, and the Gospels were written decades later, is there any chance the Gospels authors had read about the fruit of the Spirit? And if they had read about the fruit of the Spirit, is there any chance their narratives of Jesus' life would focus on examples of how he exemplified the kind of faith at work that encompasses the fruit of the Spirit? The most likely of the Gospel's authors to have read Paul seems to have been John. Before diving in, it's worth noting that we don't really know who wrote John's Gospel. It was attributed to John, the disciple, but that kind of attribution was acceptable in the first century. Attributing a book to someone was a compliment. In the case of John's Gospel, it's entirely possible that a community developed around the historical disciple after his death to preserve his teachings. John's Gospel became the final collection of teachings John's community felt were consistent with Jesus' spirit. Why is John's Gospel the most likely one to have been influenced by Paul? To begin with, it was the last of the Gospels to be written down, and most scholars put the date at around 100 AD. This is approximately 40 to 50 years after the letter to the Galatians circulated. So, the timing that places the letter to the Galatians before the Gospel of John makes a connection possible. But just because the letter to the Galatians was written before the Gospel of John had been completed, it doesn't mean that the author of John's Gospel read Paul's letters. Without an internet, information could take a while to move from one place to another via the first century's World Wide Web of Roman roads and sea routes. And yet, Galatia and Ephesus, where most believe John's Gospel was written, were not that far apart. John's Gospel was written in Ephesus rather than Jerusalem because by 100 AD there was no temple and there were no Jews in Jerusalem. The Romans had tired of the Jews' stiff-necked, God's words for them in the Old Testament, nature, and killed them or chased them out into the wider world. As a result, Many of the last locals died at Masada, and those remaining in Jerusalem left as part of what's called the diaspora. Back to geography. Ephesus was a city in what is now Turkey. Galatia was a region in Turkey. Not only that, but in a time when boundaries were negotiable, Ephesus was sometimes considered part of Galatia. They were that close. After I put these pieces together, I did some searching in my incomplete and haphazard way. I found several scholars believe the compilers of John's Gospel had access to some of Paul's letters. And though these folks might not have had the letters Paul sent to Greece and Rome, a letter to churches in Galatia probably made its way to Ephesus, which also got its own letter, Ephesians. Assuming the letter to the Galatians got to Ephesus, wouldn't it be logical that John's community might make a point of connecting the Jesus stories John had told them with the fruit of the Spirit Paul wrote about? It makes sense to me. With this in mind, I reread the Gospel of John. Here's what I found. All the fruit of the Spirit Paul describes show up in the first 10 chapters of John's Gospel in a way that follows Paul's order for the fruit of the Spirit. Here is a sequential, mostly, examples of Jesus and the fruit of the Spirit in John's Gospel. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. The Word became flesh. No better example of love, agape. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Water to wine is Jesus' first miracle. He brings joy to all, chara. John chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. Jesus creates peace by throwing out the money changers, Irene. John chapter 3. Like an army advancing step by step in a siege until the goal is reached, Jesus patiently teaches Nicodemus to understand macrothumia. John chapter 4, verses 4 through 26. Jesus extends kindness to the woman at the well, Christotes. John chapter 5, verses 1 through 13. Jesus heals on the Sabbath at the pool in Bethesda. He employs goodness to help another rather than make himself appear holy. Jesus also healed to try and change a system that forbade healing on the Sabbath. This is true goodness. Agathosune. John chapter 6, verses 5 through 18. Jesus feeds a crowd and disappears, just as he did after healing in Bethesda. He doesn't wait to receive praise. Faithfulness at work. Pistis. John chapter 8, verses 3 through 17. The Mosaic law gave Jesus authority to stone an adulterous woman. Not only does he not stone her, but he tells others not to. Great strength. In this case, the authority of the law is tempered by gentleness. Preates. And then John chapter 10, verse 11 through 18, Jesus says, "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. I do this willingly." It takes self-control to sacrifice your life for another. Egretia. Now, Jesus being Jesus and all, it isn't surprising Paul's letter to the Galatians and John's Gospel would write about the same characteristics that describe Jesus. But John's sequencing of 9 aspects of the fruit of the Spirit in the first 10 chapters matches Paul's order. Odds in my world are against this being a coincidence. The so big you can't miss it connection among Jesus, Paul, and the fruit of the Spirit, as recorded in John. There is another unmissable example of a connection among Jesus, Paul, and the idea of Christians being distinguished by the fruit they bear rather than the theology they profess. In John chapter 15, verses 1 through 15, follows the linkages of Jesus with the fruit of the Spirit in the first 10 chapters. I've read the verses hundreds of times and have never connected them with Paul's teachings in Galatians. My failure to see the connection is a terrific example of reading the Bible one verse, chapter, or book at a time and not seeing the unbreakable threads woven through it. Here's a contemporary paraphrase of portions of those verses. Jesus is speaking. I am the vine, and God is the gardener. You are the branches. If you remain in my love, you will bear much fruit. If you don't, adios. People will know you are my disciples when you bear fruit, not by what you say. If you aren't connected to my love, you won't bear any fruit. I'm telling you this so my joy, chara, may be in you, and your joy, chara, may be full. Love each other as I have loved you. The word used for love is agape, adjusted for tense, case, and subject-verb agreement. I have told, taught, and showed you everything you need to know. You have everything you need to go out and bear fruit, fruit that will last. Love, agape, each other. To put it another way, now that you have been agaped, you can agape. And whatever you agape, you are connected with Jesus, with God, and with the holiest of spirits. Notice that in these verses, neither Jesus nor John commanded us to believe anything in any particular way or with any specific words. Instead, we are being commanded to do things, to act in particular ways. We are to be known by and for our fruit. Tantalizing bits and pieces. John's descriptions of Jesus begin with and loosely follow the order of the fruit of the Spirit in the letter to the Galatians. This fascinates me. It became even more fascinating when I learned that John's is the only gospel to, point 1, begin the story of Jesus with the Word becoming flesh, agape, the first fruit of the Spirit. Point 2, describe the miracle at the wedding feast, let alone as the first miracle, chara. After agape, the first fruit Paul names is chara. Point 3, show the patient teaching in the Nicodemus story, macrothumia. Point 4, describe the kindness offered the woman at the well, Christotes. Point 5, teach people not to throw the first stone or use power authorized by the law to hurt others, Preates. Point 6, have Jesus describe himself as the good shepherd who would lay down his life for his sheep and take one for the team, Ekklesia. Bottom line, two people, John and Paul, with very different experiences of Jesus, came to the same conclusions. John knew Jesus in person, and Paul met him out of person. Hey, for all I know, maybe John and Paul had in-person conversations either in Jerusalem or in a wine bar in Ephesus when Paul blew through town. Okay, I may be trying to make too much of too little here. There are other stories in John. The other Gospels could also be mined to discover Jesus acting in ways that demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit. Of course, that shouldn't be surprising. Surely what Paul knew about Jesus influenced his understanding of the fruit of the Spirit. And yet, given that the authors of John's Gospel were probably familiar with the letter to the Galatians, and given that the order of these stories, especially through the first 10 chapters, mirrors Paul's list of the fruit, the connection is enriching. I realize this analysis can seem too clever by half, and yet, sometimes random puzzle pieces fit together. So, take the grain and leave the chaff behind. A note from the author. Thank you for listening and viewing the Connections Jesus, Paul, and John chapter of Fruit for Thought. If you enjoyed today's clip, you can purchase the book by searching for Art Edwards' Fruit for Thought on Google, Amazon.com, store.bookbaby.com, or readersfavorite.com. To see clips for the rest of the book, go to the YouTube channel Casey Evans 9605. Grace and peace, Art Edwards.